Hi everyone! So since I did my review of Mariola Budek's Hair Inspirations book, I've had loads of requests from people asking me to show you how I coloured the hair and do a little bit of a demonstration for you. So the pencils that I used were the Faber-Castell Polychromos. These are my go-to pencils for hair because they're a harder oil-based lead, and that means that they keep their points for longer, which is great for making those individual strands and that kind of look of hair. So the colours that I used were cream, terracotta, burnt sienna, burnt umber and black. Now you can use any kind of pencils obviously for this. I would recommend though that you do go for an oil-based pencil or something that has a harder lead because, as I say, it will be easier to create the stranded look of hair. It's the opposite of what we usually try and do, which is a really seamless creamy blend. So yeah, that's just what you kind of have to keep in mind really. So I have the illustration here, as you can see. I'm just going to put this up here so I can check it for reference, but it's really quite an easy technique. It's how I usually colour hair. So I've zoomed you in now to the image, and I'm not going to do the whole thing. I'm just going to demonstrate a few sections because it really is a very repetitive process. You're just completely repeating what you've just done, but in individual sections. So I start off with the cream and I do an all over layer. So I'm just going to concentrate on these sections up here in the upper right quadrant of the hair. That was quite posh, wasn't it? And I'm just doing a really light layer, light pressure, and I'm using the side of the pencil. So with the rest of this tutorial, I'm going to be encouraging you to use the points of your pencil and keep them very sharp. But with this initial base layer, we're just using the side because it's a lot easier to colour a larger area, and it's not that we need any particular stranded effect yet. So this is a base layer. So I'm going to go to my next darkest colour, which is terracotta. Now I just mentioned about keeping the pencil sharp being really important. I have one of these T-Gal sharpeners and I keep it on quite a low setting, and it keeps the pencil super sharp, but it doesn't waste a lot of the pencil. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at where Mariola has left the shading guide, and I'm going to quite conservatively flick some strands out. I'm not going to go directly to the centre yet because that is our highlight area, and I want to kind of keep that intact until we come back in with our next layer, where I'll be a bit more confident about where I'm putting my strands. So starting from, as I say, this very dark shaded area, we're going to use this rocking motion of our wrist, which is the natural flexion of the wrist, to flick out some individual hair strands. So you'll find yourself kind of curving it like this to go along with the direction of this particular section of hair. So as I said, I'm keeping it restricted at the minute and restrained back down into the shaded area, and I'm not going to quite fill up that central section just yet. But I do want to make sure that we have some nice strands on show, which is where your sharp pencils come in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate the image now because, as I said, it's easier for the wrist flexion to do this than it is for it to do any other kind of direction. So just putting this up so you can see. And again, every so often I'll just give it a little twist in the T-Gal sharpener just to make sure we've got that perfectly sharp tip. And just using that natural wrist motion, bring out some of the individual strands. I'm also rotating my pencil from time to time because as you colour, this edge of the lead will become blunt, and then you can just twist the pencil in your grip to make sure that you're keeping to the sharpest edge of the pencil at all times. So that saves you sharpening it a bit as well. Now there is some more darker shaded areas down here, so I'm just going to bring that up a little bit, but again, that's all for the next layer. You don't have to worry too much at the moment. We're kind of just getting our bearings of where we're putting the different colours. So you will have this section that's untouched in the centre. Next up is the burnt sienna number 283, and again I'm just going to give that a little sharpen with the T-Gal. Doesn't matter what sharpener you use as long as you're keeping it really sharp. And this time I'm going to do exactly the same thing, but I'm not going to bring it out as far as I've brought out the terracotta. So as you can see, we've got individual strands of the burnt sienna coming out, but I'm not lengthening them as much as I did with the terracotta. So I'm restricting it back to the shaded area. And this is what I love about Mariola's style, is that she always gives us a really good shading guide of where to put our darks, our lights, our shadows and highlights. So it's easy really. So once you've put a bit of that burnt sienna in there, and you can drag a few individual strands out, don't get me wrong, it's a very organic thing. You don't have to keep it to a particular, you know, point or be very rigid with it, because hair is you know, fly away and it's not smooth and slick all of the time. So don't worry too much about listening to instruction, just kind of go with the flow and do exactly the same thing over here. Again, just from time to time, keeping the sharpness of the tip. It's really, really crucial to this. And just following the shading guidelines really. Now I would recommend, if you are printing out an image to do this particular tutorial on, I would recommend that you print it out on a smoother cardstock rather than a rougher, more textured mixed media kind of card, because the individual strands that you're creating do look a lot sharper on flatter, smoother card. I find that it's just easier to keep your strokes and your lines more individual looking on a flatter paper. So you've done your burnt sienna. The next one is the burnt umber. And again, not coming out quite as far, but just filling in some of this shaded area with our strands. And you're starting to get that contrast now between the darker and the lighter, which extend a little more. I'll just turn it around and do that again. So as you can see at the moment, we have really kept it quite conservative. We haven't ventured into this central area, and that's because this is the point where I would then take a step back, have a look and see how far we need to go. It's always better to do a little rather than too much, because then you can just add to it. But we can definitely move in further on this section with our strands. So what I would do now is to come in again with our terracotta, so it's sort of like going back to the start of the colours that we've used, making sure it's really, really sharp, and then we can be a little braver and extend further into the centre of the section. Also following some of the shading that Mariola has done here, you can see that this part is darker than this part, so we know that we can bring our terracotta right up into this section where it's most shaded. And we can also extend into the highlight as well, because no hair goes completely white on a highlight. It's still going to have some colour in it, and that's what we're trying to achieve here. So again, keeping your strokes really individual, turning it around and doing the same thing. Now some of them may touch and meet in the middle, but most of them won't. So we do want to try and keep a bit of highlight. We're trying to keep the integrity of the highlight, but just make it look a little bit more natural. We also want to keep some of that cream going down into the shaded areas, just a little, you know, little highlights of the cream here and there. Next colour is the burnt sienna. You can really bring this out now with a little heavier strokes, but still very sharp and crisp. Again, just drag those up here. Keep rotating the pencil to get the sharpest you can. And a couple of these you can sort of rock your hand over in the centre and show just a little bit of hair coming across the highlight. But just don't go too far, it's a little bit of a balancing act. But again, just kind of go with the flow of it really, and don't worry too much. So you see how we still have bits of that cream showing through, even in coming up to the deepest parts of the shadow. So the next is the burnt umber. Again, you can be a little more heavy-handed in just showing those lines. Should be rotating the page really, but in fact I will. As I've said, you can bring some of the darker colours now over the highlight, but just don't go too far with it. Keep your hand and your strokes very light. Now, this is where I come in with the cream again and just do a little bit of an all over layer with the cream, because this really seems to brighten the highlight and make it almost golden. So I'm not using too much pressure and I'm not using any strand technique or anything. I'm just adding in a little bit extra cream. So I hope you can see how just adding in that cream has lifted it a little bit. Now again, I take a step back at this point and I think, what do I think I need to do with this? And looking here, I do think I need to bring some of the darker colour just slightly here and there to be more prevalent. So I would go in again with the burnt umber. And yours will be different because you'll have put strands in different places. So you need to kind of figure out what you think will look best. But I'm just going to bring a little bit more of this out. And down as well. Keep rotating. And I'm also going to grab Terracotta because I don't want to lose that golden tone, and just make sure that we've still got that in there, but don't lose all of the cream either. It's like I said, it's a balancing act really of just putting strokes here and there, but trying to keep all of the depth and the different colours showing through. So that is kind of the point where I would decide then whether I wanted to deepen the shadows anymore, and that's where the black comes in. Now I'm not going to use a lot of this and I'm not going to use a heavy pressure, so I'm going straight to the very corner where the shading is, and I'm doing it very, very lightly indeed, because it isn't a black tone, it's not really got any black in it, but this is just going to help deepen the brown a little bit and maximise the contrast. So it's going to look really, really light over here in the highlight and then quite deep and dark over here in the shadow, and that is kind of the realism effect. So as I said, very, very lightly handed and not using too much at all. I'm not bringing it, you know, really far down into the section. And you'll find that it just does deepen those brown areas a little bit, really, because you're not pressing hard enough to make it a solid black. It just sort of ends up looking like a dark brown, which is the effect that I'm going for. So this is basically how I would colour a section of hair. I would again just have a look and see if there's any areas that I think need something doing to it. You could maybe come in with your darkest brown again and bring in a couple more very thin strands across the centre of the highlight, but that's it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to speed colour a little bit more here so that you can see a larger section of hair being done, but it's exactly the same thing. So I've already done my layer of cream, haven't I? So I'll just make sure we've got a nice highlighted layer, and then I'll do a little bit more. So when you're doing areas that do tend to have deeper shading, like this section here, for example, there's barely any highlight on this. Of course, you can extend and bring your darker colours in further than we did on this initial section, because you're just following the shading and the highlights on the different sections of hair. So as you can see here, I've pulled this one out really quite far, and I've also come in from the bottom as well. And again here on this particular part, there's barely any highlights, so I've really brought the terracotta almost right out to the end there. So just following exactly what you're given, basically. So there we are, that's exactly how I coloured the hair on the Mariolo Budek picture that I did for the review. And if you do have any of these sections that seem to be popping up and popping out, I would tend to make those quite light, just because they're sort of bouncing up from the hair, so I would guess that they would catch light a little bit more than the deeper, sort of more inset sections of the hair. So I'll just go over them with a bit of cream and just do exactly what we did before, just adding in bits of deeper colours here and there where you think they're needed. So I'll just do that really, really quickly. But other than that, there's nothing else to really tell. It's quite an easy thing to do. It's a little time consuming, and it requires you to sometimes just have a think, a step back and a think of what more needs to be done, because it is that kind of process of deciding, does it need more layers of colour? Does it need to be brought out a bit more with the cream, or does it need to be scaled back from the orange into the deeper tones? It really, really just depends. But that's these particular colours that I'm using, and it'll be different for obviously whichever colour scheme you decide. So I'm just adding in little bits of colour here and there on these highlighted sections, and really it's just strands of pencil. I'm not being very careful with it, and I'm just keeping that very organic look of flyaway hair. So there will be bits of hair all over the place, as there is in real life, and it won't always look perfect, because no hair ever really does, and I think it just gives it that look. And if you want to kind of define those pieces of hair, just come up with your darker colour and sort of outline the section a little bit so they look a little bit more defined. But it's very rough and ready, and that's just how I like to colour. I'm not a very precise person, but I do think it still looks really effective and real, I hope. So do let me know whether you've enjoyed this review or not. I'd really appreciate a thumbs up and a comment. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please do that for more of this kind of thing. So thank you very much for watching, and I will see you soon on Colour with Claire.